Humble beginnings. The year was 1958, a few years before the beaching cut, and when mass dieselisation was starting to come into top gear. Many rural routes were being systematically closed due to loss of traffic and money. One such route was one between the towns of Lewes and East Grinstead, and had been closed for a considerable amount of time. 1 year later, though, a group of people formed the Lewes and East Grinstead Railway Preservation Society, the forerunner of the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society. The original intention of the founders was to reopen the line in its entirety from East Grinstead through to Lewes, and to run a commercial service using an ex-Great Western Flying Banana diesel rail car, to be augmented with a 2-car DMU when funds permitted. These plans, however, soon fell through when they failed to acquire the whole line, and not surprisingly found no enthusiasm for the idea amongst the local population. So, the idea to reopen the Sheffield Park to Horsted Keynes section as a steam museum railway was proposed and adopted. Stepney stood on a cold, damp siding, among other engines due to be withdrawn. He had been there for a few days now, after being withdrawn himself, after giving many years of good service to his line, and was feeling afraid. Oh my, he thought sadly to himself, whatever's going to become of me? But he soon found out. He noticed some workmen coming towards him. They started to get him steamed up, and took him to an engine workshop. After many hours, he emerged working fully, with a coat of black paint lined with red. Stepney was utterly bewildered by this until his driver came. "Stepney, you lucky old engine," he smiled. "You've been saved! The Bluebell Railway has bought you!" Stepney's eyes widened. I am?" he said, blinking in disbelief, and then whistled loudly with joy. Some time later, a small group of people, led by a balding middle-aged man, came to meet Stepney. This man was the general manager, Mr. Horace May, who told him about the society and about its new home. "Oh, thank you very much, sir," Stepney smiled happily. Stepney was then cold and watered and taken to where 2 old coaches were waiting for him. "Now, Stepney," Mr. May smiled, "we shall now be taking you to your new home on the Bluebell, via the Haywards Heath route." Stepney was puzzled by this. "Am I actually allowed to run on those lines, sir, especially if electric trains still run there?" "Don't you worry about that," Mr. May smiled, and climbed into the train. So, Stepney set off from Brighton en route to Haywards Heath, where he was diverted onto the electrified Arding line. As he trundled along, a funny feeling began to creep into his boiler. He was beginning to feel nervous, but also proud, because, known to him later on, he would become the first engine to run on the very first standard gauge railway in the country to be preserved. His arrival was greeted warmly at the junction at Horsted Keynes, before he ran round his train, preparing to head south. As he headed down the line, he saw people lining the line side, armed with cameras, and others waving to them as he pulled into the southern terminus at Sheffield Park. He was then greeted by a large crowd on the platform who cheered as he pulled into the station. As the society gathered together, Stepney stood on the platform and thought to himself, "I think I'm going to enjoy living here." Many weeks went by, and a flurry of activity began. Coaches were arriving fresh from the other railway and were being repainted blue. They also received a new engine, a small P-class tank engine numbered 323. This was, of course, Bluebell. Originally, the society were trying to get hold of another of Stepney's brothers, but they were still needed on the railway network, so they had to make do with the result, which later turned out to be fairly reasonable. After a few days of her arrival, Stepney and number 323 worked well together, and they were soon the best of friends. Then, one beautiful August morning, the great day came. The two engines were cleaned to perfection and were given their names in white paint. A large crowd were waiting on the platform, more than what the station had when it was last used in service. 323 stood at the down end of the station ready for a naming ceremony, while Stepney stood on the up end with two of the coaches waiting for the signal to change for him to come in with the first train. The two engines were amazed by the mass of the crowds. "Goodness," said Stepney, "we need a shoehorn to get this lot in." "We'll manage somehow," assured his driver. "Look, the ceremony's starting." They heard a call from the platform at number 323, and she advanced forward towards the station platform. The society's chairman and a few others went round to her front and introduced them to the guests of honour, Captain Anthony Kimmins and his wife. Following a brief speech, Mrs. Kimmins gave number 323 her official name, Bluebell, greeted with a chorus of cheers and a whistle from Stepney. When the naming was over, Captain Kimmins walked over to the signal frame, accompanied by the signalman, and then pulled the up-starting signal lever. "Come on, Stepney," said the driver. "Now it's our turn." And with that, Stepney advanced toward the platform to another chorus of cheers, and while Bluebell was being coupled up to the rear of the train, the passengers embarked on what would be the first ever Bluebell railway train. "Right then," whistled Stepney. "Let's go," tooted Bluebell. The guard's whistle blew, and to another chorus of cheers, the two engines set off on the first stage of their long days ahead. Percy, Thomas and Toby stood silent. "That was wonderful," said Toby at last. "What I really call humble beginnings," agreed Thomas. "Yes," said Bluebell. "Since that day many visitors came, and as each year passed, more and more engines were bought and preserved." "And," finished Stepney, "it wasn't until the summer of 1994 that we reached the first part of our northern extension, Kingscote, and eventually we hope to extend all the way to East Grinstead and become a connected railway once again." Stepney and Bluebell stayed on the branch line for a week or two, and it was soon time for them to move on to the next part of their tour, the Oakham Road Railway. The engines came to see them off at the junction. "Give Leo and Ross my regards," called Thomas. "They both have our old railway spirit to be proud of." "I will," smiled Stepney. "It'll be nice seeing my good old friend the Lion again. Thank you for your hospitality. I hope we all meet again. Goodbye!" And with that, Stepney and Bluebell set off to a chorus of cheers and whistles on the next stage of their long tour.